As millions of American women cast their ballot in 2020, they carry with them the peril, grit, and fortitude of thousands of outspoken foremothers who battled for voting rights. A century after women won the right to vote, the fight continues. Since the nation's founding, voting in America has met obstacles. In 1789, the year George Washington was elected president, under governing state law, only white male landowners, 6% of the population, could legally vote, leaving 94% of the population, including enslaved African Americans and women, without a say in the laws and policies that affected their daily lives. Since then, to overcome each barrier to enfranchisement, enslavement, property ownership, literacy, race, and sex, has taken years of struggle. By 1856, all states had eliminated property ownership as a voting requirement, for white men only. Women had a long road ahead before they could vote or hold office. Most Americans believed the social order depended upon a separation of gender roles, and women had all the influence they needed by inspiring morality in their husbands. During the first half of the 19th century, within newly forming women's labor associations and the rising anti-slavery crusade, the seeds of women's suffrage sprouted. Abolitionists such as Harriet Tubman and Charlotte Grimke, and labor leaders like Harriet Hanson Robinson led the way. Oh, that I could do much towards bettering our condition. I will do all the very little that lies in my power, while life and strength last. Charlotte Grimke. In 1848, when women were forbidden from speaking in public, some 300 men and women joined organizers Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott in Seneca Falls, New York, for the country's first women's rights convention. They resolved in the Declaration of Sentiments that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure themselves the sacred right to the elective franchise. But African American women were not invited to the event and glaringly omitted from the entire conversation. Many white suffrage leaders feared they would lose the support of influential white Southerners if they advocated for universal suffrage rather than women's suffrage. Author and teacher Frances Ellen Watkins Harper traveled the country lobbying for suffrage movements to include African American women. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Lecturer Matilda Jocelyn Gage championed the way Native American society was more inclusive of women. Labor activists such as Harriet Hanson Robinson began to see the vote as necessary to improving women's working conditions. At the close of the Civil War, the 13th and 14th Amendments abolished slavery and granted African Americans citizenship. Then, in 1869, overextending voting rights to African American men through the 15th Amendment, the women's suffrage movement split. On one side was the National Women's Suffrage Association, opposed to advancing the constitutional rights of African American men before white women. To reinforce its position, this group, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, invoked racialist and nativist rhetoric. On the other side was the American Women's Suffrage Association, supporting the 15th Amendment. Led by women such as Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Lucy Stone, and Julia Ward Howe, this group pressed for women's rights to vote on a state-by-state basis. While the general population still considered both positions far too radical to be taken seriously, bold women continued to step forward to advance their cause. In 1872, the forward-thinking advocate Victoria Woodhull ran for president at a time it was unimaginable for a woman to hold office. The economic and political prosperity African Americans experienced during Reconstruction came to an abrupt end in 1877. Southern states passed the Jim Crow laws, legalizing literacy tests, poll taxes, violence, and even lynching to to curtail the lives and voting rights of the recently emancipated. Few black men voted. Discrimination did not stop with African Americans. English literacy tests in Texas prevented most Mexican American men from voting. Native American men, not recognized as citizens, could vote only by forfeiting tribal associations, applying for naturalization, or serving in the military. And the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act barred Chinese immigrants from citizenship. As the 20th century dawned, a new generation of suffragists and labor union leaders took up the mantle of activism. With no sacredness of the ballot, there can be no sacredness of human life itself. Ida B. Wells. Wells, a journalist and early crusader for anti-lynching laws, emerged as an outspoken African-American suffragist. Activists like Maria de Guadalupe Evangelina Lopez advocated for women's vote within Spanish-speaking communities, and for indigenous people. Outspoken Native Americans, such as Suzette LaFlèche Tibbles and Zeke Kalasha, promoted cultural preservation, citizenship, and voting rights. In working-class immigrant neighborhoods, union leaders such as Rose Schneiderman, Clara Lemlich, and Lucy Parsons viewed the vote as a way to fight for safe working conditions, an 8-hour day, and minimum wage. Ardent believers in civil disobedience, Mabel Lee and Alice Paul organized women's suffrage marches. 10,000 women in New York in 1912 and 5,000 in Washington, D.C. in 1913. At the Washington, D.C. march, when black women were told to line up at the end, Ida B. Wells defiantly stepped into the middle, marching alongside white women. The work was paying off, and by 1918, 21 states allowed women to vote, some in local and some in presidential elections. But without federal protection, state voting rights could be revoked. It was time to demand the constitutional amendment for women's suffrage, languishing in Congress since 1878, be passed. In 1917, suffrage leaders focused their attention on President Woodrow Wilson and, in protest, took up residency on the doorstep of the White House for almost a year. More than 150 women were arrested, and many, led by Alice Paul, went on hunger strikes to draw public sympathy for the suffrage cause. Finally, in September 1918, Wilson lent his support, and in the spring of 1919, both houses of the U.S. Congress passed the 19th Amendment. By August 1920, the amendment was ratified as part of the U.S. Constitution, and 29 million eligible women voters could no longer be denied the right to vote based on their sex. Yet the struggle was hardly over. Millions of Americans still grappled with barriers to voting. By a miracle, the 19th Amendment has been ratified. We women have now a weapon of defense which we have never possessed before. It will be a shame and reproach to us if we do not use it. However much the white women of the country need suffrage, colored women need it more. Suffragist, educator, and author Mary Church Terrell. In the 1920s, fewer than 50% of eligible women used their new voting power. Native Americans, granted voting rights in the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, were silenced by voter literacy tests. Many Asian Americans couldn't vote until the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 granted citizenship. In 1921, when African American women appealed to the National Woman Party for support, they were told their disenfranchisement was an issue of race and not gender discrimination. In 1940, a mere 3% of eligible male and female black voters were registered to vote, and in the Jim Crow South, those who tried to register or vote were harassed, beaten, tortured, or lynched. Courageous women fought back. Social activist Mary Church Terrell advocated for a federal anti-lynching law. Community organizers and civil rights leaders like Septima Clark and Fannie Lou Hamer worked tirelessly throughout the South, encouraging voter registration and fighting against voter suppression in the face of escalating violence. Finally, the unspeakably hard work of so many selfless individuals culminated in the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. A few years later, in 1970, Congress additionally prohibited the use of literacy tests as a prerequisite for voting. For the first time in the history of the American Republic, federal oversight was in place, protecting the right to vote of all genders, races, and ethnicities. Voter participation skyrocketed. In 1964 Mississippi, a scant 7% of African Americans were registered to vote. 5 years later, the number was 67%. In California, encouraged by labor activist Dolores Huerta, Latino voter participation increased more than 25% throughout the 1970s. Since 1964, in every presidential election, women's voter participation has outstripped men's. By exercising their right to vote, women have been influencing American life in unprecedented ways. Laws and policies were enacted that advanced gender equality through family leave, birth control, equal pay, credit and banking reforms, abortion rights, and protections against sexual harassment and housing discrimination. Leadership began to look different. More and more women were voted into office. Today, though fewer than 25% of all elected officials are women, seats held by women in the U.S. Congress have gone from 0 prior to 1917 to 127 in 2020. These changes did not go unnoticed. In the final years of the 20th century, conservative strategists worked to counteract the political force of women and voters of color by purging voter lists and manipulating electoral district boundaries, which helped determine the outcome of the presidential election of 2000. Then in 2013's Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court's conservative majority struck down a formula in the 1965 Voting Rights Act that required certain states to submit changes in their voting laws for pre-clearance based on past discrimination. In a much-quoted, memorable dissent, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote, "Throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet." Absent a new pre-clearance formula enacted by Congress, some states quickly passed laws that slashed early voting, eliminated same-day registration, closed many polling places, and applied stricter ID requirements. These changes disproportionately suppress the votes of people of color and women. Voters who may not be able to travel easily to polling places, get paid time off work, or have access to newly required documentation suddenly find themselves unable to vote. It's estimated that 1 in 13 Black Americans cannot currently vote due to restrictive legislation. 1/3 of all women have documents that do not match their current name, and nearly 64% of those turned away from recent elections because of their ID have been women. Despite these alarming setbacks, 2018 saw the largest midterm election turnout of the past century, more than 122 million ballots cast, 53% by women. It was also a record-setting year for people of color and women on the ballot. Almost 600 ran for House, Senate, or governor roles, a nearly 60% increase from the previous election cycle, and some 90 new female lawmakers headed to Washington. Yet with approximately 1,700 mainly Southern polling places closed since 2013, and 36 states now requiring strict voter identification in some form, it is clear that the political voice of women and people of color is once again under attack. Motivated activists, litigators, and civil rights organizations are fighting back, running campaigns combating voter suppression and encouraging voter participation. Voting rights is not an antiquated cause. Rather, it is an ongoing and vital element of American democracy, for which we must continue to stand up and speak out.
Thank you for watching this story from our online docuseries Stand Up Speak Out, the personal politics of women's rights. Please like and subscribe and hit the bell button to be notified when a new video is up. Share with your friends. Leave us a comment with your reaction to the story. All this helps us to reach more people. Visit our website, bcvoices.org, to learn more and support our work on our next episode.